Right now we'd like to do a pretty in-depth discussion about lining off and what that involves and all of the different nuances that go into that. And this was actually something that was specifically requested by one of our followers, Daniel, who has hopes of building a big locust schooner one day. So Daniel, we really hope that this helps and either confirms or denies what you believe you know. So with that, let's dive into lining off and all of the intricacies that go into that. Well, folks, it has been a long time coming, but we are finally ready to start hanging some planks in Arabella. Well, just about ready. We've got a little bit more prep work to do, but we are about there, and that's super exciting. I mean, it's like I said, it's been a long time coming, and the planking really just kind of seems like it's a big step. I mean, it goes from something that won't float and looks boat-like to something that is very obviously a boat and can float. So we're really, really excited to get into this process. And it's a pretty nuanced process. Every boat in terms of planking is very different. It depends on the lines of the hull. So you could have two boats with relatively similar center lines. The construction process for those is pretty much the same, more or less. But when it comes to plank them, they can be completely different beasts. And from talking with folks who have done this before and who are experienced boat builders, having an experienced eye for lining off the hull and figuring out how the boat wants to be planked can be really, really beneficial, and it can make the difference between an easy plank job and a hard plank job. So with that in mind, one of the great things about this project is the awesome people that we've met and the connections that we've made doing the shows, doing the videos. The wooden boat world is pretty small, and one of the people that we've kind of rubbed shoulders with a few times and gotten to know is a gentleman by the name of Thad Danielson. And Thad teaches up at the Wooden Boat School in Maine. He is a super experienced boat builder and shipwright, and he offered to come and help us line off and get the first few planks on the boat. And we were very, very up for having Thad come and help us do that. So Thad came the other day, and we worked on lining off the hull, and we'll explain what lining off here is in a little better detail.
The topside planks are what you see.
Yes.
That makes
Those
sense.
are the lines that you see. Yes.
But to have a method so that they look good
Yeah.
is the main thing. One of the things about fitting planks is that if you take something off of here, that's going to move the other end of that plank down.
Yeah.
So you have to be really working on the whole plank in order to get it to move up everywhere.
So Thad was gracious enough to come and help us line off. And before we get into that, we got a diagram here, and I'm by no means an artist, but it should paint the picture that we need to kind of explain what is lining off, why it's so important, and just a few of the variables that go into it. It's a pretty nuanced thing, and there's a lot of things to consider, and we'll talk about a lot of those in more detail in a later video as we get to them. Right now, we just want to kind of give you a general gist so that you understand a little bit of what we're talking about. So like I said, I am no artist, so don't judge me on that. But here we have a diagram, and this is kind of roughly what our boat looks like. So her lines are pretty smooth. There's not a ton of craziness going on. So if you look at her in profile, the depth between the rabbet and the sheer strake fore and aft and midship are relatively close to each other. And if you look at her from the side, there's not a huge amount of shape. There's not a crazy turn at the bilge. So her lines are relatively gentle. Now, if you can compare that to a boat that was maybe designed more for racing, and you've got a cutaway forefoot and you have a much sharper shape to it, you would line these boats off very, very differently. And this is part of lining off, is figuring out is how exactly does this boat want to be planked. And a lot of that goes into their shape and how they were drawn and what the designer was looking at. So if your goal, like Acorn was to build boats that some schmuck like me could build in their backyard, you really care about if it's easy to plank and what that's going to be like. If your goal is to build the fastest wooden race boat you possibly can, you don't really care if planking it's a giant nightmare for the builders. Your main consideration is building a boat that is going to sail really fast. So there's a ton of differences. And basically what lining off is figuring out how to fill up the distance from your rabbit line up to your shear. So you've got a water line in your boat. So, waterline, waterline. So the planks above the waterline you're going to see. And if they're not evenly spaced, if they don't diminish proportionately, you're really going to notice. And for someone that built the boat like us, it would drive us absolutely crazy because that's all we would see every time we looked at the boat. Now below the waterline, it doesn't matter as much. As long as it's smooth and fair and strong, who really cares? The only one that's going to see it are the fishes, and they don't judge. So what lining off is trying to figure that out. So if we look at our hull, the distance between the waterline and the rabbit is relatively equal. There's a Sharpie here, between these spaces. So for us to try to fill that in, we can put on relatively equal width planks and just fill it up. Now, if we come to a boat with a lot more shape like this one, you can't really do that as much because you would have planks that are unreasonably wide at the stern and unreasonably narrow at the stem. So you do these various tricks with steelers and a bunch of other stuff, which we'll get into another time. But basically what you're going to try to do is figure out is, all right, if I put in a chunk of plank, I'll use the Sharpie. So if I put in a chunk of plank with a nib in it, then I can put in another plank with a nib, and that would generally be a steeler, and it's a way to just kind of fill that space up. So when you line off, you're trying to determine what you need to do and how you need to lay these planks so that by the time you get to the water line, the planks look good, they lay nice and fair on the boat, and it's going to be really pleasing to your eye when you look at those lines in the planking. So when you're lining off the hull, there's a few places on the hull that you really need to take into consideration through this whole process. So you can use our handy dandy model here to show that. And thank you, Mike, so much. This has turned out to be a phenomenal teaching aid. All right, so on the boat, you got the keel timber down here, and where the keel timber and the frame meet is the first plank on the boat, and that's called the Garber Plank. The Garber Plank is really important because it really helps to tie the keel timber into the frames and add a lot of strength and rigidity to all that. We'll get into that a little bit more later. The next point you want to really consider is the turn of the bilge here, and that's where those frames really start to tweak out as they come away from the hull. And you want to pay very close attention to that because there's so much shape there that it's going to be a little bit trickier to fit the planks. And then you get a nice, generally flat-ish run where it's not too bad. And then the next big part is called the line of the tuck. And it's kind of hard to see on our boat because she's not that dramatically shaped. But if you were dealing with more of like a race style boat that maybe had a transom, the line of the tuck would be a lot more obvious. But generally it follows just a gentle sweeping curve, oftentimes right underneath the water line. And it's just this natural, smooth curve underneath that churn right below the water line. The next one is the water line, and the reason you're concerned about the water line is purely for visual aesthetics. So anything below the water line is underwater, and if the planks are a little funky shaped, who really cares? And then the last place is the shear, and that is the last plank that goes onto the boat. And as just like the rest of the stuff above waterline, it's a very visual thing, and you want to make sure that you get that really nice and fair and proportional. Otherwise, it's just not going to look very good. So those are the big points that we're looking for as we go through the lining off process, and we're trying to take all of those into consideration at the same time, as along with a bunch of other information. It's a lot like lofting, where everything is tied together. And if you tug on one little corner of the net, you tug on the entire net. And you got to make sure that everything is tugged in the right direction and working together. You can't look at anything solely in isolation. How tall should we realistically try to make the garboard?
As tall as you can, especially amidships.
A few more specific. So
I was thinking 10 inches.
okay. Because I mean, when you say as wide as we can, we have oak planks that are quarter sawn and 20 inches wide and 3 inches thick that we could hew a Garber plank out of. You could do it.
You probably don't want to.
I don't think I want to. No. So that's kind of what I was asking.
No, I mean, if you really are staying in the water all the time.
As long as we own her, that's the plan. But who knows what happens when we're gone?
Right. But, you know, you can't worry about those guys.
Yes, guys.
You just you know.
Yeah.
You just have to work it so for you.
One of Thad's ideas was to make the garber taller amidship by about 3 inches. Since there is more beam amidship than there is fore and aft, there is a greater distance to travel from the bottom of the boat to the sheer, meaning that planks often all need to be shaped wider in the midsection to make up for that distance and look even. By adding these 3 inches now, we may be able to avoid those shapes for the rest of the planking.
And they should end up being perfect.
That'd be easy.
I think so.
So this is where the garboard plank is going to land. Like I said, it's the first plank on the boat. And the garboard plank is often of hardwood, even if the rest of the planking is of softwood. It can be thicker at times. And the reasons for this is, like I said, it's a very structural plank. So if you can imagine, say hypothetically, we put on a big 12-inch tall garboard. And when you put it back here, and you put the screws into it and you fasten it, you end up putting screws into the keel timber, into the stern, as well into the stern knee. And that ties all of that together. It basically acts as a big gusset on either side of the boat. And if these timbers want to move, they've got to move those fasteners, they got to move those planks, and that really helps with the rigidity. If you go forward a little bit, another advantageous part of having a tall garboard is that we can put screws into the rabbet here, and we can also put fastenings through the frames. And this really goes a long way towards strengthening the connection between our keel timber here and our frames. So some of you have noticed, and were very concerned when we screwed these in initially and that's all that was holding them. The connection between these frames and our center line is what keeping the boat afloat. Because the ballast keel is bolted very well to this keel timber and wants to head to the bottom of the ocean. And all of the buoyancy of the hull above us is lifting up. And this line right here at the top of the keel timber, or down here at the rabbet, are the two places where that's most likely to start to separate. And even a separation of a 1/16 of an inch can be enough to start those seams weeping water, and you really don't want that. So having that tall garboard, you can really tie all of this together, and you can make it more or less so that if this wants to open up, it has to split that plank, which if you do it out of like oak and maybe you make it a little thicker than the rest of the planks, it's going to be a tough thing for it to do. So it adds a lot of strength. It also ends up box beaming the keel. So you have these two tall, wide boards on either side of the boat fastened to everything, and it essentially makes almost like an I-beam structure out of it. So that's why the garboards, they're so important, and they add so much strength to the boat. Now, putting on a big plank like this, it has its challenges and it has its risks. So if the boat was going to be in and out of the water a lot, say you were going to haul it out every winter, a really tall garboard might actually not be a good thing. And the reason for that is as wood dries and gets wet, it swells and it shrinks. So if you have a 12-inch plank, it's going to move more than if you had 3 planks in that same area. And that's just because it's going to be a proportional thing. So if you have a foot and it moves, say, 1/4 of an inch, and you have 2 planks to 6 inches, so each plank is only going to move 1/8 of an inch. And that has less of an effect on each of those seams. The cotton and everything is able to handle that better. So for us, with Arabella, she's going to be a boat that, as long as we own her, is going to go in the water and is basically going to stay there, except for an annual haul out, which will not be enough time for her to really dry out. So we can run the risk and put on a big garboard and have that added strength, but not worry too much about the risks of that swelling and shrinking and stressing the fasteners and all of that. Where if she were a bit smaller boat and we were planning on hauling her out every winter, it might make more sense to put in less of a big garboard, so that as those planks dry out and swell and dry out and swell and go through those cycles, they move less and they stress themselves and they stress the fasteners less. Another thing you have to consider with a tall garboard is backing the planks out. So if you go here and say we go with that 12-inch garboard, you can see we've got a little bit of a gap here. And you're not going to be able to put the plank in and bend it this way too much. The wood's not really going to like that. So what you end up doing is having to back the plank out. So in this, we would shave off the top edge of the plank so that this came back and sat flush. And that's called backing out or scrubbing when you do a plank. And if we jump up forward a bit, you'll see where this becomes even more severe. In the stern of the boat, if we put on a 12-inch wide garboard, we had about 3/16 of an inch that we would need to scrub or back out to get that plank to sit flush against the frames. Now if we come forward here, we're about midship now, and we do the same thing and go to put on our 12-inch garboard, we are now looking at almost 3/8 of scrubbing that we're going to have to do. And that's one of the considerations that you need to take into consideration when you're figuring out your garboard and your planking stock and all of that, is how much or how little you're going to scrub out. And that's really going to depend on the shape of your boat. The more shapely it is, the more scrubbing out you're likely going to have to do. It also depends on how wide of planks you want to put on your boat. So for instance, if we didn't want to put a 12-inch garboard, say we wanted to do an 8-inch garboard, we would have a 1/16 of an inch of backing out to do, and we would have probably no backing out to do in the stern. So that's the advantage of putting on those narrower planks, is you're going to have less scrubbing and less backing out to do, but you're going to have more planks to hang and you're going to have more seams to deal with. Now if you put on wider planks, each individual plank is going to move, they're going to swell and shrink a little bit more than the narrower planks would. And you're going to have to start with thicker stock because you're going to have to do more scrubbing out and more backing out to get that plank to sit flush against the frames. So it's really a toss-up between putting on narrow planks with less backing out and scrubbing, or thicker planks and doing more backing out and scrubbing. And that's why if you read about boat building, they'll tell you that the planking finishes at a specific measurement. And they say finishes because it is often going to start thicker than that. So when we put the planks on Arabella, they're all more than likely going to go on at a little bit different thickness, and that's going to depend on how much we have to back out and scrub for each plank. Because if we're going to put a plank here that's going to finish 1 1/4 inch and we have 3/8 of scrubbing that we need to do, we need to add that 3/8 to that 1 1/4 inch plank before we hang it so that we have that scrubbing out to do. Otherwise, we're going to end up with too thin of a plank where we do that scrubbing. So it's just a big toss-up between doing the wider planks with a lot more scrubbing or the narrow planks with less scrubbing. And it's really just going to depend on your preferences, the use for the boat, and what planking stock you have. So for us, we have a lot of really wide oak and we have a lot of really thick oak. So we can rip it down and put on narrow planks, or we have the option of doing a bunch of scrubbing and putting on some wider ones. 2, 3, 4.
Yep.
Most of this stack here, they're pretty clear. They got a halfway decent sweep to them.
Yep.
And we can get 2 planks out of each one because they're twice as thick as they need to be.
Right. I mean, you do have to back them out.
Yeah, but depending on how much we got to back
So
them out and what we have to do.
Right.
But yeah.
We got out of the boathouse for a little walk through the woods. In the last couple of years, the 10 caterpillars have decimated the white oaks, and we were thinking about harvesting some that have been dying lately. We weren't sure whether we'd cut or not, but it was great to walk with Thad and see the forest through his eyes for a minute.
The chestnut keeps growing up from the rootstock
Yeah.
like that.
Bunch of chestnut around.
But it dies off when it gets to maturity.
That is a pretty decent one.
Yep.
It's good that some of the white oaks made it, because without some white oaks, there would be no more white oak acorns and no more white oaks, because we do have more reds than whites.
Right.
we'll start at midship for figuring out the lining off, and we'll do it from about the waterline for our boat down to where the top of the garboard's going to be. And what you're going to do is take this measurement and whatever that is, and you're going to divide it by the width of the planks that you think are going to fit well into that section. And that's going to depend on the curvature of the boat. And if you find that you want really narrow planks in one spot and wider planks in the other because of the curve, you can just move that line for where you want to line off from, because it makes more sense to do it in smaller chunks as opposed to trying to line off the entire boat. Let's say we're going to go from the waterline down to the garboard, and it seems like we can put on evenly widthed planks. There's not any crazy shape in that distance. So we would put on just a little straight edge and figure out what width plank would look good. So here, 6 inches, we would barely have to do any scrubbing, and that's pretty reasonable for our planking stock. So hypothetically, we'll go with 6 inches for each plank in here. So you'll take that distance from your waterline down to the top of your garboard that you're trying to figure out how to fill, and you will just divide that by 6 inches, and that'll tell you how many planks you need to put in there. Or you can go conversely and measure that distance and divide it by how many planks you want to put in, and then that'll give you the exact plank width. Basically what we're trying to figure out is how many planks and what exact their widths need to be to fit this. And once you have that figured out, you can go and create a diminishing board, and that will give you the rest of them for the entire boat. And we'll show you how to use a diminishing board here in a second. And keep one little trick here in mind is when you're measuring this line that you want to follow the frame, and you also want it to be the outside of planking, because it's going to be a greater distance on the outside of the planking than it is going to be on the inside of the planking. So if you measure directly against the frames, you might end up a little short from where you want it to be. So once you figured out your plank width and number of planks at midship, you can then figure out the rest of the diminishing board. So what you need to do is measure from your stem to your stern and figure out how long that needs to be, and then that's going to get scaled. And you're going to take measurements at every frame, every station, just depending on how kind of particular you want to be about it. And then you're going to take that length and where all of those stations or frames land on that, and you're going to scale them. Because if you don't scale it, you're going to need a diminishing board that is as long as the longest plank on your boat, which for us is about 40 feet, and that would be a little problematic. So figure out whatever scale. You can probably use the same scale that's on the plans, or you just need to scale it, and you need to know what scale it is so that you can take that into account when you do the final measurements. But you'll take the board and you'll have the scale, so you'll know that 1 inch equals 1 foot, and frames are 1 inch on center. That makes it really easy. So then you would take this board and you would come down it and you would mark at every frame or every station. So say they were 1 inch. So that's frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, all the way down your diminishing board, scaled to whatever scale you took off the boat. And then what you're going to do is go measure the widths at each one of those. So pardon my heinously ugly boat here. And we're trying to fill in between the garboard and the waterline. So you're going to go at every frame or station, whichever you chose to do, and you're going to measure the distance along the curve and for outside of planking from your garboard to your waterline, or whatever distance it is that you're trying to fill in. And then you're going to divide that by the number of planks, and we determined that by the midship, where it's the widest. So on our boat with midship, it is, we'll say they're 6 inch wide planks, and then maybe towards the stern here, they end up being, 5.5, and then they drop down to 4. And I know this drawing isn't accurate to that, but we'll just go with it. And then maybe it's 5, it's 4, maybe it's 2.5, maybe it's 2, and then it becomes 1. And like I said, you find that by taking the number of planks to fill that space, dividing it, and then that'll give you the individual plank width at that station or at that frame. Now you're going to take these and plot them on your diminishing board, And you scale the length, but you don't scale the width. You leave the width full size. So if we came through and midship, it was 6 inches. And then we come forward and it's 5 inches. And then it's 4. And then it's maybe it drops to 2.5. And then I get down to 1. And this is here is midship. And then say they narrow to the stern, same kind of deal. So we have 5. Maybe they drop all the way to 3. And they get down to maybe 1.5. And then 1. And these, obviously, I didn't put them evenly, but they would all be evenly spaced out depending on whatever your scale was. And now, when you have all these marks, you can take a batten and you're going to run through and you're going to connect all of these dots at the ends of all of these. And you're going to strike that line, and what that's going to let you do is go at any point in here using your scale and measure up, and you can find exactly how wide that plank needs to be between any of your frames, any of your stations. And that'll help you figure out exactly how to diminish them and what they need to look like. And that way, if you need to fit a butt block, say, and you need to do it between stations 2 and 3, you can just go to your diminishing board between stations 2 and 3, measure up until you hit your line, and you know exactly how wide that plank's going to end up being. And by using the diminishing board, you can make sure that everything is even and fair, and you can figure all of that out before you start hanging planks on the boat. And you can use the diminishing board and line off the entire hull. You can line it off in smaller sections. And like I said, you can use the diminishing board as well to do the tile in your bathroom or the planks on a funky shaped deck. We really hope that kind of broad overview of what lining off is and all of the things that we're trying to take into consideration, we hope that makes sense and help to clarify some of this for folks. As we go through the process and we start backing out planks and we start doing more detailed lining off on Arabella, we'll go into it all more in depth into each of those little, nuances of it. But we wanted to just get that big picture painted and out of the way so as we move forward, y'all kind of understand where all these pieces are going. So to us, this was kind of like describing the overall workings of an engine, and as we get into the nitty gritty, we'll show you how the carburetor works and the pistons and all that kind of stuff. But you need to understand kind of the bigger picture and where we're driving to so that you can understand some of those more nuanced pieces of it. And like we said previously, we lined off with Thad enough to know that we don't really need to line off yet. So we're going to get a few planks on Arabella. We'll cover the garboard and a bit of scrubbing out and backing out as we get those planks hung. And once we claw our way a little bit closer towards the waterline, we'll do some detailed lining off and we'll go into the diminishing board and all of that for Arabella at that time. But hopefully this kind of paints a picture for y'all and gives you kind of an idea of the considerations that we're doing and kind of the nuances a little bit of lining off and how this really is just a giant web and so much to consider as you're trying to figure out how to hang the planks. We haven't addressed the whole Macaw tennis ball treatment thing with the Kiva, but before we do that, we want to talk a little bit about what's going on behind me. So if you look behind me, you'll see that we've got the second of the garboard strakes on Arabella, and it's all clamped in place with a couple car jacks and some ratchet straps and a whole bunch of other shenanigans. And we are getting ready to fasten that off today. So if you follow us on Instagram or Facebook, you've seen some posts about these, and obviously we haven't got there quite yet in the videos. And there's a reason to that, and there's a method to the madness. Planking is going to take us a while, and it's going to be a very repetitive process. So what we're doing right now is trying to get a lot of the talking and instructions and talking about what we're doing and the reasons behind it out of the way now. And what we're doing with the work is getting a little bit farther and farther ahead of where the videos are. And that way, once we really get into the swing of planking, we can catch y'all up much closer to real time and take what is going to be 2 or 3 months worth of planking and condense it down to 3 or 4 videos instead of like 8 or 12 videos, which will be a lot more interesting and engaging for you. And Ben, the editor, doesn't have to try to figure out how to make a whole bunch of interesting planking videos. So that's why if you follow on Instagram or Facebook, you see that the work is getting farther and farther ahead from the videos right now. But don't worry, they'll get caught back up. And there's, like I said, a method to that madness. So, back to the parrot. Or the macaw, I guess. So, one of our viewers sent us this, the note saying to give it the tennis ball treatment. And we were kind of on the fence about that, because although Akiva would absolutely love to annihilate this thing, we really enjoy Leo's project, and we like what he's doing, and we have absolutely zero animosity towards him. So we were kind of on the fence, and we put it out to y'all, and it was very, very, very clear to save it and put it in the boathouse somewhere as kind of a shout out to Leo. So we will have the parrot macaw in the boathouse. We just got to make sure it's up and out of the way, because if Akiva gets it, he's going to rip it apart in like 2 seconds flat. And don't worry, I think Akiva will be satiated. Thankfully, we have a bunch of fans, and they sent him a few gifts.
Oh, he's so happy right now.
He found one he likes. I don't know how or why, but they must smell different, feel different, taste different, but...
Yeah. You're all wet. Rain coming through over there?
He caught a chipmunk in here the other day.
A what?
He caught a chipmunk in the boathouse the other day. They run along the back there, and he lays and just waits.
That's a good dog.